They came off the trains with hollow eyes and clenched jaws, stunned by how quiet the platform was. No fists, no barking dogs, no jeering crowds. After years of propaganda and 1,000 whispered rumors, the first thing many German prisoners of war heard on American soil was an ordinary voice telling them to form lines and keep their kit bags moving. The second thing they noticed was the smell. Hot bread from a mess hall, coffee that didn't taste like burned chicory, meat that wasn't padded with turnip, and impossibly the sweet, thick chill of a machine churning cream and sugar into something they had not tasted since childhood Sundays. They had braced for beatings and interrogation lamps. What they found instead was a fence line, a schedule, a baseball diamond raked flat as a parade ground, a library with dog-eared adventure novels, and a canteen where a corporal in an apron could pull a lever and turn a drum of ice into a smile. To understand the shock of that first day, you have to sit in a wooden guard box in Tunisia in 1943 or on a hedgerow in Normandy in 1944 and listen to men trading a very different picture of captivity. The word America had been used in barracks talk like a threat and a fantasy at once. Some said the Allies starved prisoners. Others said they cut fingers. Others said this was propaganda and that Americans were soft shopkeepers who could be fooled with a straight back and a well-pressed tunic. Then the shooting stopped for each man in a private way, a grenade that didn't care what he believed, a tank's coaxial gun that scribbled the terms of surrender, a white cloth waved with more hope than dignity, and suddenly he belonged to another army's paperwork. In those minutes between war and whatever came next, dread did the loudest talking. The U.S. camps were not built to tenderize souls. They were built to be legible, inspectable, and boring. A watchtower in the corner, floodlights strung like a county fair, gates that opened on whistles and closed on whistles. The men who ran them were not saints and did not pretend to be. They were quartermasters and officers of the Provost Marshal General's office with clipboards full of rules that had been drafted in peacetime, stamped in 1929 at a conference table in Geneva, and now hauled into the biggest war the planet had ever arranged. A prisoner coming off the train at a place like Camp Hearn in Texas or Camp Algona in Iowa would be counted, deloused, issued a cot, and told where the latrines were. He would be told the hours. He would be told how to complain, where to stand, and who to salute. He would be told, in a voice that sounded more like a school principal than a conqueror, that he would be fed well and worked hard. And then, if he arrived on the right afternoon, he would hear the iron belly of the ice cream freezer turning behind the mess hall door. That moment a spoon, a tin cup, a sweet cold mouthful is easy to sentimentalize and just as easy to sneer at. It is better to see it for what it really was. A policy arriving on a pallet. Good treatment of prisoners was not charity. It was an instrument. Feed them as well as regulation allowed. Keep them healthy enough to labor on farms that desperately needed hands. Make the fences high and the rules clear. And you reduced the number of fights, the number of escapes, the number of headlines that would boomerang back to American prisoners in Europe. You also overturned a story the Nazi state needed to tell, which was that the enemy had no honor and no mercy. The spoon was discipline. The ice cream was logistics. The smile, if it came at all, was a side effect. When night fell on that first day, floodlights threw long pale triangles across the yard, and new arrivals tested the perimeter with eyes rather than feet. They smoked Red Cross cigarettes and lay on clean sheets that smelled faintly of warehouses. Somewhere past the wire, a locomotive sang, and in the distance a high school band practiced the same stumbling march it had practiced every autumn since the town's grandparents were young. Many prisoners wrote in their heads what they would later write on postcards home. They would be careful with words. Censors read everything. They would omit the taste of butterfat. They would say the guards were firm but fair. They would say they were not beaten. They would be surprised at how quickly their hands remembered work that was not war-peeling potatoes, scrubbing floors because the next day would arrive, and with it a rhythm, and with the rhythm a kind of weary safety. The surprise would not end quickly. It would deepen into a question. Why this? Why here? Why them? That question is the opening hinge of the story. It swings between fear and relief, between imagination and policy, between the myths that travel with soldiers and the receipts that live in ledgers. It is not the story of indulgence. It is the story of a nation that could afford, by 1944, to turn sugar and milk into discipline, and that decided to do so in front of the men it had shot at last week. You could call it kindness. You could call it proof of system. Both are true enough to stand, but neither fully explains the look on a man's face when he takes his first bite and realizes that his captors intend to keep the promises they put on paper 15 years earlier in a Swiss conference room. That look is the beginning of our work. The rest of this narrative will not pretend every camp was a postcard or that every decision was pure. It will keep us inside real rooms with real names on the doors and real temperatures on the thermometers. It will explain why prisoners expected pain and why they encountered a rulebook instead. It will map the chain of command that led from Washington offices to prairie compounds, the inspection regimes that checked them, and the daily motions work details, mail lines, movie nights that turned a barbed wire world into a machine that ran on predictability. We start here, at the mess window, because it collapses 1,000 abstractions into a single sensible detail: a ladle, a scoop, the heavy clink of a tin cup on a tray. The war, for a moment, tastes like home, and the fact that it can taste like this at all is the strangest thing in the room. What happens to a man's certainty when a system he was taught to despise hands him a treat? What happens to rumour when it strikes a fence made of facts? The next pages answer with names and dates and the kind of numbers that make arguments boring and unassailable. But before we count anything, hold the picture steady. A yard floodlit like a stage. A line that shortens. A machine that hums. A prisoner who breathes in and finds that the air is sweet. That is the hinge. It does not close for a long time. Expectation is a kind of armour, and these men had spent years riveting it to themselves. The Germany that marched its sons to North Africa and Normandy girded them not only with weapons, but with the stories it needed them to believe. Some of those stories were as old as war. The enemy is cruel. The enemy will make you talk. The enemy treats prisoners like animals. Others were newer, assembled by ministries with patient clerks and a talent for rewriting the map of the mind. By 1943, the German radio could serve 3 courses of fear in a single broadcast. It reminded listeners of Allied bombers over Hamburg, foregrounded tales of Soviet reprisals in the East, and salted the mix with anecdotes never quite sourced about British or American mistreatment of prisoners. These were not presented as rumours. They were presented as the last thin threads of dignity. Hold out. Do not surrender. The alternative is starvation and insult. In barracks and foxholes, the tales multiplied in ways bureaucrats could not script. A corporal who knew a man who had heard from a cousin who had talked to someone on leave near a railway siding would say that carriages full of captured soldiers were sent west without water. A sergeant would say the British shaved heads, the Americans shaved stripes, the Canadians beat the soles of your feet. Details changed with the teller, the shape of the fear did not. In a culture already trained by years of Gleichschaltung to accept official narratives and to distrust dissent as weakness, these stories cemented into a knowledge that called itself hard. The worst ones thrived because they answered a need. They told the wounded that staying in the fight was safer than surrendering. They told the bitter that the enemy's talk of rules was a lie. They told the proud that to bow one's head and live was a gamble not worth the risk. But propaganda works best when it has a substrate of truth to grip, and there were truths to use. Europe in 1941 and 1942 had seen brutality that would have broken the spine of any treaty if treaties had spines to break. On the Eastern Front, the German state waged a war that named whole categories of humans as beneath law. In the West, reprisals for resistance killings produced walls riddled with bullets and streets that smelled of cordite and terror. Men who had seen such things could be forgiven for believing that surrender simply moved you from one kind of danger into another. They were not wrong to imagine cruelty. They were wrong to imagine it as policy in the American system they were about to enter. Between these two thoughts, what they had witnessed What they would meet was a chasm bridged only by paper and by Americans who, for their own reasons, meant to keep that paper sacred enough. Even those who distrusted official propaganda were ready to believe the worst because hunger teaches its own doctrine. By late 1944, German rations at home and at the front were uneven and often grim. Ersatz coffee had come to taste like the era, which is to say like a compromise no one wanted to talk about. Bread was padded with potatoes, meat with memory. The men who rounded the edges of their fear with irony joked about Russian and Amerikanisch, as if invoking a myth could keep it away. They had heard about American abundance the way one hears about Atlantis, an island of factories and butter where even the poor could be fat. But the idea that such abundance would be extended to them after surrender struck them as risible. One did not expect one's captors to be generous. One expected them to be efficient, and efficiency, in a dark imagination, meant extracting labor from a starved body at the lowest possible cost. Inside the Wehrmacht itself, the instruction was ambivalent. Manuals acknowledged the 1929 Geneva Convention because Germany had signed it, and officers who cared about their men's fate if captured encouraged adherence to forms that might one day be repaid. Yet in other places, the word Geneva was a sneer, a bourgeois luxury that tougher armies did not require. Men took the cue that suited the cynicism nearest to hand. The result was a goulash of belief in which the very notion of a rules-bound captivity seemed exotic. In this mix, the rumor of torture did two jobs. It hardened resolve, and it preemptively explained away the shame of surrender. If you gave up and survived it, you had done so against monstrous odds. If you died in the attempt, your comrades could explain why you chose to keep firing. Then there were the photographs, which traveled farther and faster than any clerked rumor. Newsreels showed American bombers like migrating geese, lines of trucks like arteries, mountains of ammunition like geology. Men looking at those images were not merely counting enemies. They were counting what had been poured into a society to make such images possible. Mass production, they called it, as if the words themselves were a threat. If an enemy could make that many planes that fast, what could he do to you once you ceased to be a target and became a problem? The imagination did not fill with kindness. It filled with machines efficient in their cruelty, tireless in their work. All of this is to say that when a captured soldier sat on a wooden bench in a U.S. camp and watched a kitchen corporal turn a crank on a frozen barrel, he was not simply tasting something sweet. He was shattering an inward monument. He had expected a room with a single light and a man who did not tire of asking his name. He had expected a belly that growled itself to sleep. To be offered calories and routine and a chance to write home without having his words tortured into propaganda was to encounter a different kind of power than the one he had prepared for. It was still power. The fence reminded him of that every time it threw back the floodlights and glittered. The guards' rifles reminded him of that when they turned at the catwalk's corner. But it was power that preferred order over pain, predictability over drama. For men trained to think of enemies as varieties of threat, this difference was not subtle. It was the whole new world. Not every prisoner shed his fear at once. Some waited for the trick behind the kindness. Some found it, in small humiliations or in the way a guard's joke could shrink a man to a single nervous twitch. Some kept the fear because it felt safer than wagering against it. But each day that passed without the knock on the skull, each letter received from home that said, "Yes, your postcard arrived and we are well." Each afternoon when a work detail came back dusty and tired and unbloodied, chipped away at the armor propaganda had welded. In its place grew another armor that looked like habit. The war outside the wire kept spinning its catastrophes. Inside, the men learned the schedule, and learned that the schedule, and not the whip, was what ruled here. The surprise at finding ice cream was not childish. It was political. It announced that the captor believed his own law enough to feed it to his enemy. That announcement, repeated 3 times a day in a mess line and inked in regulations that might be read in a library after supper, began the long, slow erosion of terror. It did not erase the war. It did not soften the wire. It simply replaced a story with a structure. And once a man learns the shape of the room he is kept in, he looks for the door that rules have built for him, grievances addressed, wages tallied in coupons instead of currency, hours of work exchanged for cigarettes instead of bruises. That is how expectation yields to experience. It does not surrender. It is outvoted by facts. There is a ledger behind every ladle. The taste of the mess line was backed by a treaty whose sentences were plain enough to survive translation. In the summer of 1929, delegates in Geneva argued through the details of a convention that would bind signatories to treat prisoners of war as soldiers who had stepped off the battlefield rather than as criminals who had stepped into a void. The resulting text was not poetry. It was a checklist. Rations comparable to those of the detaining power's troops, medical care, correspondence, the right to receive relief parcels, the prohibition of cruelty and public curiosity, the regulation of labor so that it fit the prisoner's rank and physique and never directly served the captor's war industries. When the United States entered the New World War a dozen years later, those lines were not dusty. They were in the hands of men who expected to be judged by them and inspected against them. In Washington, the office that mattered most for this story sat beneath the title of the Provost Marshal General. The bureaucratic path from conference room to camp went through that door. Circulars, memoranda, inspection protocols, pay tables, and disciplinary codes flowed outward from it, to the commandants who managed barbed wire and gates across dozens of states. The International Committee of the Red Cross, armed with clipboards and gravitas, visited the camps and wrote reports that could sting. Army surgeons made rounds and wrote their own. In other words, the fence was not the only boundary. A web of oversight pinned the system to its promises. That web did not prevent every abuse. It made abuses answerable and, more importantly for the men standing in line for supper, it made predictability the default. Predictability is a moral good when you are counted twice a day and sleep under lights that can snap on without warning. It was built from specifications. Rations were planned to track what American soldiers ate, adapted to available supplies, and adjusted as the war's logistics tilted and groaned. Meat, bread, vegetables, coffee, and a caloric load that respected the Geneva demand for equivalence gave the mess hall its rhythm. Medical care followed Army doctrine. Sick call was not a rumor but a line that formed each morning, and the men who ran it had training, bandages, thermometers, and the authority to send a man to hospital rather than to work. Mail longed for with an intensity that would shame poets was regulated in both directions. There were forms, there were limits on length and frequency, there were stampings and censors and delays, but there was also the knowledge that if you wrote and if your family wrote, the odds favored a letter finding its way across oceans and battle lines. Work, which would structure so many days, came wrapped in rules. Officers were exempt, a fact that bred a complicated classroom of resentments inside the wire. Enlisted men could be assigned to agriculture, forestry, road maintenance, and other tasks that did not directly load bullets into rifles. They could be paid wages, commissary coupons more often than cash that bought tobacco, soap, and sometimes sweets at the canteen. Those wages were not generosity. They were the consequence of paper signed in a room where the men at the table had tried to imagine what power would do to the powerless if it were not combed straight. The paper did not perfectly tame power, but it put in place something that looks, at ground level, like a timetable. The men who lived under it learned that if they followed the timetable, their days had edges that did not cut. Discipline existed and could be hard. The same codes that set rations equal to soldiers' meals outlined punishments for insubordination, escape attempts, and violence, confinement, loss of privileges, and in extreme cases, prosecution under military law signaled that the wire was not only to be respected but to be believed in. Yet discipline itself was formalized. Investigations produced transcripts rather than rumors. Commandants answered to inspectors whose careers did not rest on their friendship. The system was not tender, it was measured. Measurement is not the opposite of cruelty, but it is its enemy more often than not, because it forces reasons to be spoken aloud and written down, and spoken and written reasons can be audited. Exactly because the rules had to be lived, they made space for what seems soft from a distance, a baseball field leveled and chalked so that men could sweat their boredom out in the late afternoon, a library with volumes sent by charities and by the Army's own services, a projector and reels that brought a black and white America into a room where guards stood along the wall and watched with the same rapt relief. None of those amenities were spelled out in Geneva with that kind of specificity. They were the flowers that grow in the cracks of a paved road, a peacetime instinct that seized what the rules protected and filled it with civic furniture. The ice cream machine was part of that furniture in some camps, appearing as a Sunday treat, a holiday gesture, a reward after harvest work. If you look at it as policy, you see a caloric surplus made visible. If you look at it as psychology, you see a calculated normalcy. If you look at it as a man who has marched across 2 continents, you see the absence of fear for 5 minutes. Oversight mattered because it turned the promise into a habit. Red Cross visitors wrote down the number of men to a barrack, the condition of latrines, the schedule of parcels. They interviewed prisoners and commandants separately. They returned later to see whether repairs had been made or discipline lightened where it had been heavy-handed. Army inspectors counted mattresses, measured calories, and read the camp's own paperwork against the rules. The existence of those visitors and those counters did more than fix problems. It created a culture in which a commandant knew that the story he told about his camp would be checked against a ledger and a witness. In such a culture, kindness becomes less discretionary and more structural. A prisoner might not know the names of the offices in Washington. He might never see the letters on Red Cross letterhead, but he would feel the pressure of those documents in the reliability with which his day unfolded. None of this made captivity easy. The ache of wire is not cured by a scoop of anything. The anxiety of not knowing when the war would end and what the letter from home would say could not be outvoted by a clean sheet. What the rules did, what the governance did, was to take one set of terrors off the table. The man who expected to be beaten for sport learned that if he was beaten, someone would have to sign for it and might have to answer for it. The man who expected calculated starvation learned that his grievances were about taste and monotony rather than about survival. The man who expected interrogation lights learned that the lights in the yard were for watching, not for burning. In a world as damaged as 1944, these were not small gifts. They were the difference between living in a cage and living in a system. From the outside, the fence and the watchtowers are the symbols that hold the eye. From the inside, what holds a man together is the opposite of spectacle. It is the fact that lights go out at the same time every night. It is the fact that Wednesday's soup tastes like last Wednesday's soup. It is the fact that when you line up and hold out your cup, the ladle does not tremble and the spoon is the same size it was yesterday. Rules built that sameness. Offices defended it. Inspectors checked it. And because those things were true, a story told in German barracks about what Americans would do to a defeated enemy began to crack at the edges, then down the middle, then into pieces so small they could be washed away with dishwater. To understand why the mess line could feel inexhaustible and why a treat could appear with the regularity of Sunday, you have to count. The United States held hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners by the war's peak, the overwhelming majority of them German. The country was large enough to swallow those men into its interior and spread them across main camps and branch camps, the way a railroad spreads freight. Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas and Iowa, the Carolinas and the piney stretches of the South fences sprouted on the edges of towns that had never thought of themselves as actors in a world war, until trucks began to arrive with men who wore field grey. Each main camp acted like a hub. From it, work details radiated to farms, canneries, lumber camps, and road crews that needed muscle more than they needed speeches. When harvest came and the orchards hung heavy, the branch camps multiplied like summer storms, canvas and lumber thrown up around a borrowed field to house 100 men who would rise before dawn and march to the rows. Feeding this human network was a problem perfectly suited to a nation that had spent the previous decade learning to count at industrial scale. Army quartermasters contracted meat and grain and coffee by the trainload, and they measured success not in adjectives but in calories delivered to plates on time. Prisoners felt the result as a kind of sufficiency that bordered in their memories on astonishment. Bread arrived in loaves that tasted of wheat rather than of the compromises of war. Meat could be tough or dull, but it was there. Vegetables crowded the plate in season and withdrew in winter, replaced by the canned solidity of American plenty. Coffee steamed in tin cups in amounts that a soldier from a ration-strained army could not take for granted. Sugar was present enough that dessert, even if it was nothing more than a square of something brown and sweet or a scoop of something cold on the weekends, became part of the grammar of the meal. Clothing and shelter were administered with the same prosaic efficiency. Barracks sprang up in rows as straight as a thought. Stoves squatted at intervals that made sense to men who had calculated how much coal they could haul and how much warmth a body needed to sleep. Blankets were scratchy but clean. Windows opened and closed. Latrines had a smell that was unavoidable and a schedule that was enforced. A man could complain. Sometimes he did. The point is that his complaint entered a system that expected complaints to be logged and resolved, and even when nothing changed, the act of recording gave the day a shape. You were a number, yes, but you were a number that appeared on a list that someone was supposed to reconcile with another list by Friday. Work pulled all these lists into motion. America's farms had lost sons to uniforms and could not afford to let crops rot for lack of hands. Prisoners marched into fields at dawn, signed their names with a guard watching, and learned the feel of fruit against the palm instead of a rifle stock. They learned the rhythm of cannery floors where tins sang in metallic choruses and steam made afternoons feel like saunas. In forests, saws spoke a language older than war. On roads, shovels and rakes translated orders into the stubborn grammar of gravel and earth. None of this was romance. It was fatiguing, and it was honest, and it was fenced. At day's end, the men returned to their compounds with muscles warm and tempers cooled by labour that was not designed to break them, but to use them. The canteen sat at the intersection of those flows. It transformed commissary coupons, wages earned by the day's work, into small luxuries. Tobacco and soap first, almost everywhere. Postcards and pencils always. Candy when it could be had, and in some places, when the freezer hummed and the supply train had been kind, scoops of ice cream that turned a day of picking into a memory men would write into letters as carefully as they wrote the weather. The machine's presence was not universal, and not constant. It was seasonal in some camps, event-bound in others, mechanical in its failures as any machine must be, but when it worked, it became the most vivid emblem of an economy that did not regard the prisoner as a resource to be ground into the machine and discarded. It regarded him as a resource to be cycled, fed, worked, paid in coupons, walked back under guard, counted, and fed again. Mail connected this interior life to the world beyond the wire with a reliability that still startles in retrospect. Sacks arrived and were sorted. Names were called. Men lined up with a palpable mixture of hope and dread. Censors opened envelopes and read quickly, blacking out what the rules required and leaving as much as they could, because a man who reads a letter and writes another is easier to manage than a man who feels severed. Parcels from the Red Cross thickened the diet and softened the edges of want. The delay between sending and receiving could stretch to weeks or months, and during those spans men learned to treasure patterns over speed. Tuesday might become the day the sacks usually came. The routine subordinated the pain of waiting to the knowledge that waiting had an end. Inspection added a drumbeat under everything. The knowledge that someone would come through counting mattresses and peering into kitchens did not make every lieutenant a saint, but it made him keep a ledger that had to be squared. When a stove was broken, the inspector could note it, and the next report would check whether it had been repaired. When a punishment seemed harsh, a colonel in another state might read the transcript and ask for an explanation. The system's failings usually lived at the edges, in moments of temper, in the friction of personalities, in the quiet cruelty that any hierarchy is tempted to indulge. Its successes lived in the middle, in routines that were so regular they vanished from memory. That is why the extraordinary things are remembered with such crystalline brightness. A prisoner could forget the exact number of potatoes on Tuesday, but would never forget the first time the mess line served something cold enough to hurt his teeth. Scale did not erase individuality. In a camp like Concordia in Kansas or Algona in Iowa, the numbers were large enough to make aerial photographs look like board games. But inside each rectangle of barracks, a dozen stories learned to breathe at once. Men found friends. Men found rivals. Men negotiated the politics of status that had followed them under the wire, with officers on one set of bunks and enlisted men on another, party loyalists and skeptics speaking in tones they thought were safe. Work crews formed their own societies, bound by tasks and jokes and the way humans carry themselves when they are tired together. Guards developed favorites they would never admit to, and routines they could not imagine changing. The machine ran on schedules and supplies, but it also ran on private compacts, and the natural tendency of people in confined spaces to invent small rituals, an evening walk to the same stretch of fence, a poker game that rotated among bunks, a choir that taught harmony to men who had only ever learned how to march in unison. The sheer size of the enterprise meant that it could not be spun out of sentiment. It required trains to arrive when they were supposed to, contracts to be honored by suppliers who had their own quotas, welders to patch the pots in the kitchen, mechanics to keep the ice cream churn's motor from freezing or burning out. It required the state to keep its own word, and that, perhaps more than anything, is why the story feels strange to modern ears. We are used to policy as rhetoric. In those years, policy reached all the way to the spoon, and the spoon reached all the way to a man's calculation of whether the world was still governed by something other than force. The magnitude of the system, hundreds of camps, thousands of branch sites, millions of meals served, made the exception stand out. An abuse could not be defended by the excuse that there was no time to do otherwise. The trainloads of sugar and flour said there was time. The balance sheet said the system intended to be itself. So when you picture those men in line with their tin cups, do not imagine an accident. Imagine an apparatus. Imagine maps on office walls with red pins for main camps and blue pins for branch sites. Imagine a chalkboard in a mess hall with quantities and menus, and the clipped handwriting of a sergeant who learned to manage a kitchen the way another man learned to fire a mortar. Imagine a storeroom where a corporal signs a receipt for a crate of milk and another for a sack of sugar and mutters about the line of work he never expected to have. The taste at the end of that chain is simple. The chain is not. It took a continent's worth of factories and an army's worth of clerks to put sweetness into the hands of men the country had been trained to kill. That is the scale. That is the logistics. That is why the story begins in a mess line and reaches all the way back to a treaty written in a room where no one was hungry. The train slowed with a squeal that made everyone on the benches sit a little straighter, not from hope but from the reflex of men who had learned that the next sound dictated the next fate. When the doors slid back, a flat light spilled, over faces creased by dust. The platform did not look like an enemy's triumphal arch. It looked like an ordinary siding on the edge of an American town, where the water tower wore the town's name in block letters, and a wind moved through scrub grass, with the same indifferent rhythm it had before anyone ever heard of. Stukas. A detail of military police formed up without shouting. There were dogs, but they panted as if the day bored them. The guards' rifles were present without presence, slung neat and level, the way a carpenter carries a tool he uses every hour without thinking about it. The air smelled like creosote, hot iron, and unexpectedly fresh bread. Orders came in short bursts and translated themselves with ease. Fall in, keep your kits. 2 abreast. The column moved along the platform and out under a sky that seemed too big, as if the country had unrolled itself to watch the new arrivals. It took only a few minutes to pass through the gate and into the first compound, because someone had planned for this and had planned for the paperwork to be brisk. Beyond the double strand of wire, a row of buildings ran straight as if drawn with a ruler: processing hut, medical office, delousing shed, clothing issue, mess, The sequence was not designed to impress. It was designed to turn chaos into a line. Each man advanced from bench to bench and filled a blank with his name and number. A clerk with a pencil he had sharpened too often read the answers without interest and wrote legibly because he had learned that illegible names jammed the machine. The new arrivals learned to attach a kind of gratitude to the clerk's boredom. A bored clerk meant this would go quickly. Delousing was as undignified as choreographies of cleanliness must be. Shirts and trousers went into piles that smelled of steam. Powder surged in white clouds and settled on skin. The shower had pressure and heat that surprised men who had become used to faucets that wheezed excuses. Doctors and medics looked into throats and ears and eyes and made notations on forms clipped to boards. No one asked clever questions. No one asked for secrets. No one produced a light bulb and the bare chairmen had seen in films. Instead, there were coughs to be listened to, rashes to be noted, a toothache to be recorded for dental work on a list that lived in a drawer labelled with an index card in a hand that had learned to give each letter its due. Somewhere beyond those drawers, the machinery of oversight waited to be fed its first numbers. Here at the threshold, the men who mattered were the ones who kept pencils sharp and towels moving. Clothing issued after the showers fit like clothing not chosen by the person wearing it. The fabric was a compromise between durability and the budgets of men who did not have to wear it. Boots felt solid and wrong. The barracks they were sent to next were cleaner than anyone had feared and more crowded than anyone had hoped. Cots stood in orderly ranks and blankets lay folded at attention. A stove with a belly like a drum waited for evening. Windows opened with a squeak, and a breeze pushed the day's heat around the room, as if testing whether it could make the new men sweat with the old salt of peacetime labour. Somewhere in that long first hour, the rumour ran through the ranks that there would be food soon, and not merely food, but a mess line with options that suggested cooks believed in choices. It was this news, more than the fences or the stoves, that began to pry open the armour of dread. Hunger could make a cynic, but it could also make a believer in small mercies. The mess hall doors opened with industrial grace and exhaled a fragrance that was not the smell of triumph but of habit. Bread and fat, coffee and onions, a broth with heft. Tin trays slid along rails polished by 1,000 other trays. Behind the line, a man in an apron stood with a ladle that gave the same portion to each cup with metronomic exactness. The first bite of meatloaf tasted of kitchens rather than campaigns. The coffee was not ersatz. It announced itself with steam and a bitterness that spoke of beans bought by the truckload. Bread yielded under the pressure of a thumb and left a dent, and even that dent felt like a kind of proof. Then there was the sound, mechanical and low, of a drum turning inside a metal body. It was not on the line yet. The cooks kept it near the far counter with the air of men who understood the power of a well-timed reveal. Voices rose and fell without crescendo until a corporal, his sleeves rolled and his hairline traced with flour, rolled the machine forward and set a spigot over a row of cups that had been wiped with more care than their tin warranted. The first stream was pale and thick. It piled itself rather than poured. A guard standing at the corner watched the room, while pretending not to watch at all. The corporal announced in a voice that belonged to the baseball diamond, rather than the battlefield, that this would be available after the hot servings, and that anyone making noise about it would find himself on dish patrol. The threat carried no malice and all the authority of routine. No one tested it. To call that first taste a shock is to rob it of its pedestrian grandeur. It was cold at a depth that startled teeth. It brought with it a sweetness that refused to break down into the rationed sugar men had cheated and hoarded and traded for months. It tasted like a kitchen where a clock ticked and a radio muttered and no one was counting the minutes between sirens. It did not change the fence outside. It did not change the orders that would wake the men early to sweep barracks and form up for counts. It did not change the habit of fear that made shoulders tighten when boots thudded near the door, but it made the room real in a new way. It presented a fact that could not be argued away by prior dread. A system that included such a thing either hid a cruelty deeper than imagination or ran on principles alien to those dreads. The men who had learned to trust danger more than comfort took another spoonful and decided to postpone choosing which explanation they preferred. Evening turned the yard into a geometry lesson in light and shadow. The march to the barracks after the meal felt less like a procession to a cell than like a return to a place where a timetable reigned. The men looked up and saw stars that seemed closer than they had been on ships. They heard a train in the distance and felt, through the soles of their feet, the rumble of things moving toward other towns to feed other lines. In the bunk nearest the stove, a man wrote in a small notebook that had survived 3 fronts and imagined how to fit this day into a letter his mother would read in a kitchen with no curtains because war had taken the cloth for bandages. He knew the censors would black out what they must and leave what they could. He wrote about order. He wrote about food. He did not write the word ice cream. He did not need to. The rest of the letter would carry it. The last sound before sleep was the quiet step of a guard passing on the catwalk and the barely audible murmur of a stove settling. Men slept like men who had been saved from a choice they had been dreading. Morning would come, and with it a routine that would collect their hours and spend them on chores and on work beyond the wire. The first day had given them only a glimpse of that shape. It had given them more, a mouthful of the future they could not yet name. The astonishment slotted itself into place with the rest of the day's facts. It did not diminish. It did not inflate. It sat there with the weight of a ladle and the hum of a machine, and told the men that what they had expected about their captors would need to be rewritten in the precise ink of ordinary life. The simplest way to explain why a frozen dessert appeared inside a barbed wire world is to say that the nation could afford it. But that sentence hides a century of agriculture, industry, and administration that had taught Americans to convert milk and sugar into shelf life and morale. The machine in the mess hall was only the last link in a chain that began in fields and factories that reached across a continent and ended in a policy that insisted on equivalence between the captor's soldier and the captive's circumstances. When the camp's quartermaster signed for dairy, he participated in a logistics language that had been perfected by peacetime abundance and had been disciplined by wartime schedules. Demand was forecast. Supply was distributed by railroads that spoke in timetables like liturgy, and cooks translated tons into portions, with the kind of mathematics that becomes invisible only when it is successful. Policy, not sentiment, demanded that prisoners be fed comparably to the troops of the detaining power. There is a plainness to that requirement that has the virtue of being unglamorous. It did not promise indulgence. It promised an equivalence rooted in the belief that predictable calories produce fewer problems than unpredictable hunger. A prisoner who eats well enough to work and sleep is a prisoner who fights less and schemes less. A prisoner who can buy small luxuries with wages earned on lawful labor is one whose appetite for conflict has been turned into an appetite for routine. The dessert was not a flourish added by kindly cooks alone. It was an index of compliance with a rule that monitored numbers more than feelings. The fact that it tasted of childhood did not make it childish. It made it powerful. There was a second arithmetic at work, no less hard-nosed for being humane. Every guard in a watchtower, every clerk at a desk, every colonel 1,000 miles away understood that treatment moves through channels in both directions. News of cruelty colors the fates of one's own captured soldiers. News of order secures them. The calculus did not imagine an adversary capable of perfect reciprocation, especially not on fronts where hatred had unmoored itself from law. But in the theatres where reciprocity could be argued into existence by intermediaries and neutral inspectors, the record mattered. To keep the record clean was to negotiate for one's own without speaking to the captor at all. The machine that turned cream into a Sunday scoop hummed in sympathy with cables that crossed oceans and reports that crossed desks. It announced that the detaining power believed its law enough to make it edible. The abundance that made such gestures possible was not abstract. It could be counted in carloads of grain and vats of condensed milk and bins of sugar pulled from warehouses that had grown fat under a system that had found ways to send tractors into fields and electrify towns and standardize refrigeration. Even rationing, which pressed American households into the war's arithmetic, left a surplus of efficiency that soldiers and prisoners could taste. Factories ran at a pace that would have seemed insane a decade earlier. Farms found their way through shortages of labor, with machines and with the labor of the very men behind the wire, who harvested fruit and loaded crates because policy allowed their work to support the economy so long as it did not spill directly into munitions. When something sweet arrived at the end of a workday, it sat at the junction of two truths. The nation had more than enough, and the nation had chosen to run itself by rules. Skeptics inside the wire sensed calculation in every kindness, and they were not wrong. The best-run camps understood that satisfying small appetites paid dividends in order. A canteen that exchanged coupons for cigarettes and soap and occasional treats smoothed 1,000 irritations no memorandum could reach. The dessert did not erase resentments about rank or about politics or about the relationships between men with different loyalties trapped in one rectangle of ground, but it took the temperature down just enough to make the next count quiet. In a world where noise could escalate into grievance, and grievance into a scuffle that required paperwork, a quiet count was worth a line in a quartermaster's ledger. When supply permitted, the cooks obliged, not as benefactors but as custodians of a fragile peace that needed reinforcement at mealtimes. There was also the matter of demonstration. Camps were inspected by the Red Cross and by the Army's own officers. Conditions were described in reports that spoke in a vocabulary of adequacy and deficiency. To meet or exceed expectations in visible ways was to inoculate the camp against criticism that could ripple upward and outward. A camp commandant who could point to a well-run mess with a varied menu signaled that he understood both the letter and the spirit of the conventions he was obliged to keep. The hum of a freezer did not cover the sound of a man being mistreated, but it did speak to a culture that aimed to make such mistreatment anomalous. In that context, the ice cream became a symbol, not of indulgence, but of compliance with a standard that prized predictability over drama. The men eating it supplied the final reason, the one that lives at the granular level where policy and logistics fail to satisfy alone. Humans under strain respond to sensory experiences with a directness that bypasses the social armor they wear for one another. The shock of cold on the tongue, the sweetness that requires no translation, the muscle memory of a treat tied to leisure and to the days before scarcity, all these worked on men who had spent months or years eating to survive rather than eating to feel human. That small restoration of a pre-war self did not make anyone forget the wire. It did not erase what they had fought for or what they still believed, but it lubricated the machinery of coexistence inside the fence. Men who had felt humiliated by defeat could stand in a line and trade jokes, however thin, about flavor. Men who had nursed grudges could, for a moment, surrender to the ordinary topic of how much is enough. Even contempt, which thrives in privation, loses a sliver of its grip when a mouthful is good. The arguments against such treatment often came from outside the wire, in letters to newspapers or in conversations at kitchen tables where ration books lay open. What, critics asked, did it say about priorities when enemy soldiers licked spoons while American families counted their sugar coupons? The answer, when camp officers were forced to give it out loud, was that the integrity of the system mattered more than the performance of severity. The law required a standard, and nations do not win by lowering their own bar to satisfy anger. It was not a comfortable answer, it was the right one. It acknowledged that in war a society must decide not only how it will kill, but how it will live while it is killing. The dessert was, improbably, a public ethics written in dairy. The men at the counter did not recite any of these justifications, and the cooks did not compose essays while they pulled the lever. Each had a simpler task. The prisoner brought a cup and held it steady. The cook filled it to the line that his hand knew without looking. The guard watched the doorway with a peripheral vision sharpened by boredom. The machine hummed, choking a little when a belt needed tightening. In that small circle of motion, an empire of supply and doctrine found its way into a moment that could be dismissed as trivial by anyone who had never learned how prisons and camps depend on careful triviality. A society that can turn its principles into food is dangerous to any story that relies on hunger to make men obedient. In this way, the dessert became a language the camp spoke to its inhabitants. You will be treated as the law says you will be treated, not because you deserve it, not because we are sentimental, but because we have decided that our strength is measured by the distance between what we could do and what we choose to do. When a man finished his cup, he did not become someone else. He became, for a minute, the person he had been before the war taught him to bargain with himself every morning. He put the cup on the tray, thanked no one because the ritual did not require gratitude, and walked back into a routine that would keep him busy and inside the fence until a treaty and a timetable told him otherwise. The machinery of abundance and policy kept turning behind him. The hum dwindled with the day's supply, and the cooks hosed the floor with a kind of weary satisfaction that belongs to any trade that ends with clean surfaces and stacked pans. The reasons would remain uneaten, but the proof had been swallowed. It was enough. The first morning the work detail left the main camp before sunrise. The compound sounded like rain made of boots. The sky was a dull slate that promised heat later and mercy now. Guards counted men into groups that would be held together not by ideology or rank, but by tasks that made sense to civilians. Picking fruit, stacking crates, sweeping floors that never stayed clean, bending steel's will with equipment that still smelled of the factory. There was no ceremony about it. The lists had been made the night before. The truck engines coughed awake. The men climbed in with the resignation of labourers and the curiosity of exiles. Out in the country, the trees stood like a patient army in formation, their branches heavy enough to command respect. The farmer waited by the gate with a clipboard he held, as if it were a shield. He had worries stamped into his face that had nothing to do with geopolitics, and everything to do with hail and frost, and whether the refrigerated rail car would be on time tomorrow. When the men climbed down, he looked at them the way a man looks at strangers who might rearrange his day. The guard introduced the foreman on the crew, a prisoner who had earned trust by keeping count and keeping tempers down, and the three of them conferred in muted tones while the rest of the men stretched, yawned, and pretended not to notice the dog tied near the barn. Work in an orchard demands a humility that soldiers understand only after they discover how fruit bruises if you handle it the way you handle a canteen. The ladders looked like sketches of bones against the grey, and the day learned its rhythm by the third hour. Hans remembered that grip is different when the stakes are sweetness rather than survival. The baskets filled and were emptied into crates that absorbed 1,000 small collisions without complaint. The farmer's daughter came out with a jug of water and a thin stack of paper cups that whispered against each other. She did not stare. She had lived with this arrangement long enough to find it merely odd rather than frightening. The prisoners drank and let the water run down their throats with a greed they were not ashamed of. The guard leaned against the truck and watched the road because that is what his training told him to do when nothing else required him to speak. By mid-morning the sun established itself as a fact. Hats came down lower. The chatter changed from cautious to practical. A man from Hamburg taught a man from Swabia a better knot for the twine that held the sacks closed. A man who claimed Paris as his favourite city, despite never having been there, told a joke that did not translate well but earned a smile for effort. The foreman reminded a young prisoner that the crate's corners were not to be kicked into place because the paper under the fingernails mattered. The farmer, who had begun the day wary of having uniformed strangers around his trees, found that the line of men on ladders made sense to his sense of the world. He offered an apple cut in clean eighths with a pocket knife. The gesture sat on the boundary between policy and neighbourliness. The men ate, careful not to seem eager. In canneries the noise raised itself until conversation became a form of pantomime with nouns shouted and verbs indicated by hands. Steam wrapped the afternoon in a dampness that glued shirts to backs and made complaints stick in the throat and slide back down. The assembly line whispered and rattled and sang. Men learned to move tins in patterns that punished carelessness and rewarded rhythm. On the wall above the wash station, a safety poster declared dangers with cheerful drawings that made the foreman laugh in a way that did not feel cruel. He showed a new arrival where his fingers should be if he wanted to keep them. The clock supervised from above the doorway with a sternness that was not personal. Breaks were signalled by the collapse of noise, and in those minutes the men felt a satisfaction that surprised them. It came not from ideology reversed or loyalties abandoned, but from the fact that a task had been set and met, and would be set again tomorrow. Sometimes the work detail crossed into the town's quieter rooms, spaces where the locals and the prisoners shared air without sharing much else. A church basement hosted a charity lunch one week, where the women who cooked did not exactly make a point of welcoming the men in field grey, but did not deny them the seconds they offered their neighbours either. The men ate with heads that could not decide whether to be bowed or high. In the shade outside the building, a boy of 10 sat on the steps with a baseball glove and rehearsed the famous catches he imagined making in front of crowds he had never seen. A prisoner asked in careful English what position the boy played. The boy considered the question with forensic seriousness and declared himself a shortstop. The prisoner nodded with the gravity appropriate to a role so full of possibility. He walked back to the truck with a feeling he could not name and that he did not trust. On a late summer day, when the orchard's contract had been met and the foreman's signature had made its way back to a desk where someone would process the coupons into something that could buy cigarettes and soap, the farmer's wife sent a tray of milkshakes out to the truck. The glasses were thick with frost on the outside and slick inside with sweetness. They dripped while the men worked at them like men who know how to make haste carefully. There were not enough straws for all, so the foreman sent a messenger to the canteen to return the empties and bring back paper spares. The messenger ran and came back panting with triumph at having persuaded the cook to part with more than he had wished. For days afterwards, the talk in the barracks turned, briefly and with a shy kind of hilarity, to which flavour could possibly be superior when a man had only the palate of memory to judge by. The return to camp at sundown was always the same, and always slightly different. The truck bed shook the day out of hands and shoulders, dust collected on teeth, and the first sip of water after the gate tasted like a minor miracle. Men slid back into the order of the compound with less reluctance than they would have admitted in the morning. Work had spent their bodies in ways that felt like a kind of translation from soldier to labourer, and the translation had left enough dignity intact for sleep. They lined up for mail because mail, even when it did not come, was a ritual no one wanted to forfeit. A letter from home could turn the evening into a room where voices thinned to protect privacy. A letter refused to arrive could turn the evening into a brittle thing that cracked under jokes. Now and then a baseball materialized in the yard, as if conjured by the way the afternoon light liked the backs of men in motion. Guards and prisoners found themselves on the same patch of dirt with a rulebook older than the war and easier to keep. The first time a prisoner hit a line drive that sent a guard's cap skipping toward the fence, laughter came from both sides in a pitch, so surprised it made everyone glance at the towers as if disapproval might descend from the catwalk like weather. Nothing descended. The play resumed, and the loser's penalty was a round of sweeping in the mess, where the cook had stories about a league he claimed once let him share a dugout with a man who had later become famous. No one checked the story. They preferred it true. In all this the wire remained. Men did not forget it when they spoke to the farmer about rain or to the boy about baseball. The truck always returned to the gate, and the count always worked its way down to the last digit. But it is hard to live inside a monotone without hearing undertones. Town life gave the prisoners the sensation of the country beyond their maps, a place where routine had not been devoured by slogans, where work was judged by yield and by the way a crate slid into place without splintering, where kindness wore the face of a woman handing a glass that sweated in the heat. These were not arguments, they were impressions. They filed themselves in the brain alongside the older files labelled with fear and contempt. They did not overthrow those files. They rubbed against them. Friction made heat. Heat made memory. The guards, too, were tugged by the ordinary. The same men who kept watch on the catwalk had children who existed somewhere beyond the fence, who needed school shoes and a dentist, and a father who came home tired but not angry. The job asked them to draw a line and keep it. Town life, church basements, orchards, canneries drew another line inside them, one that forced a balance between suspicion and the knowledge that routine can civilize enemies better than any speech. The result was not friendship, not even often civility in the way novels define it. It was a working truce that made the next morning possible, and then the next, When the men lay down at night, the day's images arranged themselves in the kind of order dreams can tolerate. Ladders rising against the sky, steam uncurling, from vats, a child's glove opening and closing like a sea creature in air, a glass with frost sliding down its sides, a crate that demanded square corners and got them. Somewhere beneath those images ran a current that had begun the first day in the mess line and had changed none of its direction since. Fear had learned a new language, the dialect of the predictable. It did not make the wire a friend. It made the wire a boundary inside which men could work and sleep and argue and line up for a treat when the hum near the counter began. The day grew out of that hum as much as it grew out of reveille. The next would, too. Stories thrive where facts are rationed, and the world of the camp had begun with a deficit of facts. Men arrived carrying narratives welded together by propaganda, by hearsay, and by the self-protective certainty that the worst is always safer to believe. After weeks inside a system that ran on timetables and receipts, the surviving stories had to negotiate with what the senses repeated each day. They did not disappear. They changed shape, and the changes say as much about the camps as any report filed in an inspector's drawer. The first story to attempt survival was the claim that the prisoners lived better than the civilians beyond the wire. It drew strength from visible comforts, mess lines that did not run out before the end of a shift, coffee that arrived in generous measure, occasional desserts that made memory sit up and wag its tail. Men in town, especially those with ration books that seemed to ask for explanations they were tired of giving, could look at a compound stocked to army standards and feel the insult of arithmetic. The argument rode out on kitchen tables and into letters to editors. Inside the fence, prisoners heard the rumor of resentment and felt both guilty and defensive. Reality was more awkward than the myth allowed. Civilian life in wartime America had its own abundance and its own stubborn scarcities. The camp's table was built to match the soldier's table, not to surpass it, and the parts of civilian life that define human dignity, privacy, choice, movement, remained outside the wire with a force that food could not cancel. A man who traded coupons for a cigarette still walked where he was told and slept where he was told and woke when he was told. The arithmetic of envy did not include those subtractions. Another hardy story insisted that prisoners were free to roam, as if the fence were a decoration and the watchtower a gesture. It came from the sight of work details marching into orchards and canneries and returning dusty but unbloodied, from the spectacle of baseball in the yard and of men reading on stoops as if waiting for a tram. The tale had a kernel of truth in the sense that routine can look like liberty when compared with chaos. But guards counted before departure and at return. Evading the count had consequences measured in lost privileges and confinement that made men calculate risk in a currency they understood. Escapes happened and made good copy precisely because they were rare and required the sort of nerve and luck that most men spent in combat and could not reproduce under the gaze of a catwalk. In the normal run of days, freedom was a carefully measured ingredient. It was just enough to keep the system from boiling over, never enough to blur the line between inside and out. Then there was the rumor that the sweets were constant, that the mess line had become a confectioner's bench, and that men went to sleep with sugar in their veins and smiles on their faces. It took no effort to refute, yet it persisted because it satisfied both indignation beyond the wire and nostalgia within it. The truth was drabber and more durable. Treats depended on supply, and on the kind of administrative goodwill that attended a camp with few disciplinary entries and a mess ledger that balanced. The machine's hum was seasonal and episodic. When it faltered, it disappointed men who had built Sunday around a mouthful. When it returned, it restored a small promise that owed more to the kitchen staff's pride than to any policy that required sweetness as an entitlement. Memory, with its habit of editing, later polished the schedule into a shine it did not always deserve. The most dangerous myth lived less in public discourse than in certain corners of the barracks. It whispered that the rules were a surface without depth, that behind the neat desks and inspections lay the same old appetite for domination dressed in better clothes. The men who believed this did not deny that the food was adequate or that mail moved or that sick call was something other than a rumor. They insisted those facts were camouflage and that only fools mistook the yoke for a necklace. It was a bracing argument, and a necessary one for men whose faith in the old order could not be reconciled with what their eyes recorded now. The counter-argument was not piety about the detaining power's virtues. It was evidence that the system had mechanisms for correcting itself and incentives for the people inside it to keep their worst impulses in check. A guard who lashed out in temper discovered that there were forms to fill and consequences to accept. A commandant who cut rations to punish found a report on his desk and a visit on his calendar. The rules had teeth because other offices, staffed by men with their own careers and reputations to protect, inspected those teeth. The mask, if there had been one, eventually fuses to the face it covers when worn long enough. In the camps, the face of order grew out of the habit of enforcing it. Some tales simply withered under contact with the day. The fear that interrogation would be the organizing principle of existence proved incompatible with the discovery that the organizing principles were sweep, count, work, eat, read, sleep. The dread that mail would be a mirage ran aground when names were called twice a week, with a music that made men stand straighter in line. The expectation that discipline would be arbitrary learned to distinguish between the arbitrariness of human temperament and the decisions that tracked a manual and could be appealed with success often enough to encourage appeals. And yet the persistence of old fears did not mark the prisoners as fools. Fear is a thoughtful animal. It survives on scraps and breeds in corners. The sensible fact of today does not always kill the shadow that yesterday threw. In the end, reality hardened into the sort of boredom that keeps men from breaking. The yard at dusk smelled the same most nights. Dust, sweat, a sliver of coal smoke, a faint sweetness that might be memory or might be the ghost of that day's dessert. The watchman's steps traced a metronome above. Somewhere a harmonica carved a tune out of a loneliness that did not carry beyond the wire. The myths had left their fingerprints on the minds that entertained them, but the fence collected different prints every evening, the prints of men who had eaten well enough to work again tomorrow, who had written a letter and hidden a hope inside a paragraph about weather, who had learned that rules, dull and relentless, could be kinder than improvisations dressed as passion. The story the camp told about itself did not end with dessert or with a neat moral. It ended each day with lights out on time and with the knowledge that morning would come with the same imperfect mercy. In that predictability, the grand narratives dissolved into something humbler and sturdier, something that could be lived rather than merely argued. The room for ideas looked like a borrowed hall rather than a classroom, with a projector at the back throwing its soft clatter across the benches like rain on a roof. Men filed in with the posture of people braced for boredom and found instead a program that kept returning to ordinary civic machinery, a short film on how a ballot is counted, a stitched news digest about town councils arguing over budgets, a travel reel that lingered on a school board meeting as patiently as on a skyline. The pitch was never thunder. It was routine. You could ignore a speaker, but it was difficult to ignore the demonstration that rules could be consulted by anyone in the room. In a world where power had often disguised itself as inevitability, it mattered to see a vote tallied in public, a gavel rise and fall. A clerk read minutes into a record that would outlive the argument. The library corner looked improvised, yet it had been built with care. Dictionaries sat beside paperbacks. A manual on plumbing shared a shelf with a history of the frontier. Newspapers lay clipped and mounted when an article needed context. No slogans were printed on the walls. The selection's quiet bias was toward materials that taught men how procedures worked, how a city sets a tax, how a jury is chosen, how a letter to the editor travels from desk to page. A detective novel read for plot carried, by accident, lessons about municipal hearings and editorial corrections. Sometimes a moderated discussion followed, and the sergeant who led it held to one tone, firm, not triumphant. You could disagree. You could not shout down the clock. The effect was cumulative rather than dramatic. A man could sit through a dozen evenings and feel only that he had been kept company by the hum of a machine that preferred daylight to spectacle. The projector stuttered. The lights came on at the same time. The guards at the door watched because that was their job. not because anyone expected trouble. If dessert in the mess had made law taste sweet, these nights made its habits audible, and the habits themselves became the argument. Mail call shaped the week with a gravity no parade could match. Names were read, envelopes slid from canvas sacks, and conversation thinned to a hush with its own etiquette. Men opened letters like mechanics opening a stubborn casing, careful not to tear what held them together. The sentences that arrived were domestic and unspectacular. Weather, Aunt Marta's hip, a child's new shoes, the neighbour's cow loose again. Yet in the middle of such smallness, a rumour could turn. A prisoner who had written that he was fed regularly and allowed to work sent a truth that could not easily be converted into propaganda when it reached a kitchen in Bremen or a stoop in Cologne. Families who had braced for starvation found instead a description of monotony, and monotony, translated into a mother's words, sounded like relief. The mechanism behind the letters taught its own lesson. Forms limited length and frequency. Censors blotted a line and left the rest intact. Parcels were logged, inspected, and released with a ceremony as unromantic as checking a bill of lading. The fact that a package could cross oceans and front lines and arrive with its soap uncracked argued for a world larger than the wire. Addresses printed in tidy hand taught relatives where, on a map folded into a drawer with ration coupons, a camp sat among states they had only read about in schoolbooks. Neighbours heard about the mail and adjusted their own stories of the enemy, not because they were convinced, but because the arrival of a postcard resisted denial. Not every letter brought comfort. News of a bombing or an illness landed like a shell in a quiet barracks. Even then, the act of writing back insisted on shape. A man could answer with facts rather than with fantasies about his fate. He could describe the schedule without apology and place his grief inside a structure that did not wobble. In this exchange, distance shrank not to sentiment, but to comprehensibility, which proved sturdier. No enterprise that holds thousands of men inside fences can claim spotless virtue, and this one did not. Tempers failed. A guard who carried private humiliations to work sometimes found a target. A prisoner, reckless with pride, learned that a cage could be made smaller inside the larger cage. A kitchen shorted by a rail delay discovered how quickly mood soured when monotony was joined by scarcity. Men fought each other for reasons older than politics. A commandant, impatient or vain, occasionally reached for punishments sharper than the handbook advised. The ledger fills with such entries in any system, and if you stop reading there, you can tell any story you like. Inspections mattered most on bad days. A Red Cross delegate touring the infirmary paused at a ledger and insisted that it be corrected before leaving. An army officer listening to both sides of a disciplinary case reduced a sentence not from tenderness, but from respect for precedent. A report returned for the second time, with the same note made its way to a desk where someone's promotion could be stalled. None of this erased a blow already struck. It made the next one less likely to land without consequence. The knowledge that someone from outside would walk the rows and ask particular questions discouraged those inside from improvising cruelty. There were sorrows the rules could not prevent. A man with too much time and too few letters could cultivate despair until nothing in the canteen had taste. Another ran at the fence and forced a sequence that ended in a report worded to survive scrutiny and a set of nightmares that never softened. To name these edges is not to spoil the narrative. It is to honor the part of the truth that makes the rest trustworthy. By the time trains carried men toward repatriation, the compound's lesson had settled into memory so quietly it was easy to miss. The first astonishments had come early. The meal that did not humiliate, the night that did not end in questions, the workday that concluded with a count instead of a blow. What remained at the end was the texture of predictability. The wire had never softened, yet it ceased to be the only fact. Routine layered itself over fear until fear learned to move more slowly, and in that slowing you could see the outline of a choice made far away and enforced every day. The meaning is not that captivity became kind. It is that power agreed to be legible to bystanders and chose to translate its promises into food, paper, and time. A government that feeds its enemies to a standard it has set for itself is not announcing a weakness. It is measuring its strength by the distance between what it could do and what it refuses to do. The library and the projector made that stance visible in sentences and light. Work in orchards and canneries made it audible in crates sliding shut and whistles blown on time. A dessert ladled without performance made it undeniable to the tongue. Some left unchanged, carrying their convictions like luggage that fit every doorway. Others departed with an irritation they could not name, the sensation of having met a rival whose discipline was proven in the refusal to be cruel. A few returned, years later, with families, to towns glimpsed from the back of trucks, and chose what they had once endured. The war had taught them how power breaks things. The camps had shown them how power binds itself, and how, once bound, it can be believed.